Well, Moritz asked us to write an opinionated piece on the role of expectations, in particular over-optimism of borrowers and lenders as potential drivers of the credit cycle. And of course, why? We've been discussing this a lot in the past couple of days, that credit cycles matter. Credit booms have crucial macroeconomic implications. They matter because they increase the probability of financial crises. They predict lower growth and deeper recessions. But they also, like high levels of leverage in the economy, both on the side of firms or households, tend to amplify the effects of financial shocks in the real economy. And then the question is a little bit, how do we explain the emergence of these boom-bust patterns in credit markets? As we heard in the previous talk, one of the traditional explanations for this is based on incentives, right? It's the idea that basically lenders in booms tend to take excessive risk because they don't fully internalize the potential cost of the market downward or a widespread wave of defaults. But we've been discussing also some evidence in the past couple of days that says that this is at best an incomplete view of what is generally going on, for two reasons. The first is that in general, professional investors fail to see crises coming. We've seen it in the previous talk. There are a couple of other papers that discuss this, of course, and this is not just a prerogative of stock markets or housing markets or the US market, because Matt, for example, has a paper that shows that, this is the fact that professionals fail to see crises coming tends to be something that we observe across countries all the time. And the second piece of information is a little bit what Stefani was presenting yesterday, that, this idea that banks, for example, in the US before the crisis were taking excessive risks, is actually somewhat contradicted by evidence that shows that it was really rich people, people in the upper quintiles of the income distribution, housing investors, that tended to leverage the most and then also default the most once the crisis hit. So somehow this is the question me and Kaspar are going to try to answer today, is to what extent does a sentiment-based explanation of the credit cycle help us reconciling these pieces of evidence that seem to be somewhat inconsistent with the rational view of the credit cycle. Briefly on what we think about when we think about sentiment-driven credit cycles, everything begins with a displacement. So let's think about the boom phase for the sake of an argument for a positive situation. Everything begins with an improvement in fundamentals. Prices grow for a number of consecutive periods. There are low loan losses, GDP growth, and whatnot. And basically what happens is that due to a fundamental psychological feature of economic agents, people tend to look at the recent past when they're predicting what's going to happen tomorrow, which, generally is a good heuristic. The problem is when people attach too much weight to recent private movements. So when people extrapolate, meaning in booms, this dynamic of extrapolation, of overreaction from recent crises basically can make people over-optimistic. To the extent to which, and this is of course a question, an open question, this sentiment drives credit originations, both on the lenders and the borrowers side, then you can have over-lending and over-borrowing. Eventually, these expectations, since they are optimistic, are bound to be disappointed, and you're going to be having the reversal, so defaults and crises. And there is evidence also from people in the room, theoretical evidence that shows that basically by adding beliefs in otherwise pretty standard macroeconomic models is very helpful in matching actually the theory to the data of credit. So, well, what we're going to discuss today is, as I said, this is not an original piece of research. We're going to discuss with you some evidence that comes from basically a review of the literature and some of our own work that somehow provides this theory and provides support for this theory that, of course, as we all know, originates from Minsky, the work of Minsky and Hildenberger, that the credit cycle is a sentiment-driven credit cycle. And there are three main takeaways from this talk. The first is that expectations of different economic agents are often systematically biased. And this bias is generally linked to past fundamentals. This is so not the product of random shocks, is something that endogenously arises over the cycle. The second is that expectations are capable of driving credit demand and credit supply beyond what should be rationally predictive, given market fundamentals, and that finally, this elevated sentiment is a strong predictor of reversals in prices and demand. Now, on expectation formation, I would say in the past decade there has been quite a revival of this work on expectations. In particular, of course, a lot of this work is based on surveys because it's otherwise pretty difficult to measure expectations directly. And overwhelmingly, what comes out of the research is that consumers and different economic agents tend to overreact to the recent past. This is true of professional investors in the stock market that tend to expect higher returns when they have experienced recently high returns, and so they fail to predict mean reversion. It's true of firms with CFOs and managers becoming over-optimistic about future profits whenever they experience recent growth in profits. Kaspar and Yueran have a paper in which they show that lenders, banks become over-optimistic about future profits after periods of loan losses. And finally, of course, there is a huge literature on households, possibly because of the role the household balance sheets played in the recent recession. And in particular, there is quite a bit of work done by different people, including myself, on the role of biased house price beliefs, as how these biased house price beliefs come about. And I want to, give you some descriptive evidence that comes from my paper on this, on the role of forecast errors in house price expectations made by American consumers. So these two graphs are showing you basically, so the left-hand side is a graph that shows you the evolution over time of forecast errors in house price expectations by US consumers, which I compute as the difference between the average expected price growth for each individual respondent and the exposed realization in the area where. Meaning, if these forecast errors are positive, people are over-optimistic because expectations are higher than exposed realization. So basically, this graph is just a descriptive graph. There is nothing causal or anything along these lines. But what it's telling you is two things. That on average, expectations are wrong, first of all, because these forecast errors are systematically different from zero, basically at each given point in time. And they also display a strong time component because people are over-optimistic about the future of the housing market at the beginning of the crisis, which surprises nobody, but then they stay over-optimistic, basically throughout the Great Recession. And then this pattern reverses. So people become over-pessimistic. So basically they underestimate the recent recovery in US housing markets, and they stay over-pessimistic. Basically, I dropped it. And the way we can explain this pattern is by a pattern of extrapolation, because the right-hand side is basically show you the relationship between these individual level forecast errors and the experienced house price growth that this individual respondent witnessed in their local area of residence on a period of 5 years. And this is conditional on a bunch of individual level covariates, time fixed effects and whatnot. And what this is telling you is that forecast errors are predictable given recent price growth, which is if you want to take this at face value, somewhat inconsistent with what you should see if these expectations were rational. Because under that framework, you shouldn't have predictability of forecast errors from information that is available from, to the individuals at the time they make the forecast. Now, why do we care about this? Well, as macroeconomists, we think that expectations matter for behavior, of course. These two graphs are basically just some correlations of the evolution over time of credit to GDP in green in the US economy, so the year-on-year growth rate in credit, and two measures of sentiment. On the left-hand side, you have a measure of bankers' optimism from the Duke CFO survey, and on the right-hand side is, again, house price expectations of US consumers. And of course, the correlation is pretty strong over the business cycle or not. But then there is a question of, what can we say about exactly what's the role of beliefs in causally explaining credit growth? And there are two problems generally with this. The first is that you often, at least at the micro level, do not observe subjective beliefs and objective economic behavior in the same data set. So you either make heroic assumptions or you merge data sets, or there needs to be some adjustment. And the second is that, of course, there is a question of identification, in the sense that beliefs and output are jointly determined, and it's somewhat difficult to identify this. So again, there is quite a bit of work being done on this topic. What I've done myself is I try to understand what role these house price expectations have in defining mortgage leverage on new mortgage originations. So what I do is I basically take averages, regional averages of these Michigan survey data, and I link it to individual level, loan level, new mortgage originations from Freddie Mac. And basically I say, okay, when people on average in this region become more optimistic about the housing market, do they leverage more on the mortgages they take? The answer to this question is yes and no, in the sense that on average, the effect is positive, but the main drivers of this relationship are mortgages on investment property and cash out refinances. And the way you can think about this, you can explain this evidence, is through basically what, Teresa Kukler, Johannes Strobel, and co-authors have a paper on this recently, where basically they discuss the fact that housing is not just a consumption good or an investment good, but is also a consumption good. So the only way in which house price expectations or beliefs or sentiment can drive up mortgage leverage is if people's investment motive is very strong. Because if you only have a consumption motives, if housing is simply consumption good for you, if you become more pessimistic about house prices, you're still gonna require a certain home size. So that means that if you think prices are gonna fall, you're basically gonna put less of your savings in your home, and leverage will go up, but you're not gonna buy less housing. On the other hand, if you're a pure housing investor, you're gonna buy to lever up, you're gonna lever up to buy in the expectation of a positive return on investment. And what this is, the main takeaway of this is that basically, well, it goes back to Stefania's talk yesterday, that the role of housing investors is crucial in this sense. It's crucial in understanding how beliefs can drive up mortgage leverage. And this is also somewhat consistent with a recent paper by Yueran and Sufi, where they show that the role of housing investors was quite significant during the run-up to the 2007 crisis. And now I'll leave the floor to Kaspar, who will discuss the role of lenders.
So what I'm going to do is focus on lenders. So this goes back to this credit cycle model in a way that we were thinking about before and that we looked at before. And only that now we have like a lender perspective. And we've seen like throughout the last few days, there's a ton of evidence linking like these credit expansions to like returns to crises. So there's work by Matt, Moritz, Tyler, a lot of people in the room here that basically show this relationship here. And what I do in my own work is basically we try to go like a step up the ladder and look if there's any association between initial fundamentals, so good fundamentals. So that means for banks, for example, like high profitability or like low loan losses. First of all, with expectation formation, and then with like the credit expansion and the reversal. Now I'll think about this like first association here and the second in my 3 or 4 slides that I have today. So what I do in a paper with Björn Richter, also from Bonn, is that we collect new data on banking sector profit and loss accounts for like a long sample of countries. So that means like profitability, so the return on equity, but also the components of profitability, so the income, the cost component, and the loan losses. And then what we do is we basically run like Mian Sufi Werner style regression. So we predict credit growth going forward with our fundamental variables. So this, in this case, this is here like the level, or no, this is here the change of return on equity from T-4 to T-1, and the subsequent credit expansion over the next 3 years. And this is the same graph only for the level. And you do see that there's like a strong positive correlation. So whenever profitability of the banking system is high, today, that means that credit expands over the next years. And that holds controlling for like all the macro variables and things that we can think about in our long run cross-country data, but also like in individual bank data. And what we can do is we can like basically decompose this relationship, and we do see that this relationship seems to be really very much driven by the loan loss component of the profit and loss account. And well, we interpret this as being consistent with like this instability from beliefs model. So like the reflexivity in credit markets paper that to a certain extent inspired us to do this exercise, but also like by the work by André Schleifer and his co-authors. And we can obviously look at alternative channels, and other people to a certain extent have done that. So we can look if this is a pure demand side story. So if the profitability is driven by demand, and then also the story, and we can see that after like increases of profitability are followed by decreasing bond spreads rather than increasing bond spreads. So this again exploiting the price information, and then we can also look at like banking sector net worth. So we can, for example, decompose net worth into retained earnings and dividends. And the idea is that dividends are paid out, so they're not at the disposal of the banking system anymore. And still we see this positive association between like high dividends today or positive increases in dividends today and the subsequent credit expansion. Just one more graph on the paper. So what we also look at is basically the reversal. So is there evidence that profitability, so the initial good outcomes, also have information about the subsequent reversal? And for that we can exploit financial crises as a first exercise. So we can show that profitability measures, so the return on equity and bank profits are elevated before financial crises. So they have a predictive power for financial crises in the years. We also see that loan losses are low before the financial crises. I mean, this doesn't look big here in these graphs because you have like the crisis hitting, obviously, no, but you have like an average return on equity in our sample of 8%, and you have an increase up to 10% return on equity for the entire banking system within our sample. What we also see is that return on equity already starts falling 1 year prior to the crisis start. So I think this is basically, you could think of this as like the initial bad news arriving to the bank, to the system. This also like connects, I think, nicely with like the paper by Emir and Matt, where they show that also the bank returns also start falling already in the year prior to the crisis. We can, aside from looking at financial crisis, we can also like repeat Matt's and Berens Young analysis on equity returns and basically predict equity returns with our bank fundamentals. And we do see that we can predict equity returns, but our prediction runs at a longer horizon than Matt's prediction, which is consistent because you have like the increase in profitability, which increases credit, and then you have the reversal basically at a later point. All right, so I think what this is overall consistent with, and we talked a bit about this already, is that there is like a strong association between like past fundamentals and subsequent credit standards in the banking system. So the institutional memory, as it is sometimes called, matters a lot. So like individual loss events or loss events matter a lot. So there's, I think, the nice quote in the foot paper where they show that like even the threat of a loss event which is not realized might shape risk-taking over the next years for the banking system. And I think overall, even though this is like not the one evidence that I would say like that conclusively proves that financial crises are purely driven by behavioral cycles or something like that, I think we're gaining, like behavioral expectations are gaining prominence and so on. So Yueran, I think, has also done some work on this, looking at like over-optimistic CEOs in the run-up to the crisis and how they had basically bigger exposures to the crisis and had larger losses in the crisis. So just like go now a bit into the bigger picture again. Alessia talked a bit about borrowers' expectations, and I talked about lenders' expectations. So we were discussing a lot about like whose expectations actually matter. And I think we don't have a good answer on that yet, which is partially driven by the fact that expectation measures are super correlated across these agents. Yeah? So maybe it is that expectations have to be aligned for these credit cycles to arise. So what we have here, for example, is like consumer confidence from the Michigan survey, banker optimism, highly correlated. Even if you look like within markets, so this house price expectations, again, from consumers, sales expectations from professionals, again, correlated. So we do have a lot of correlation, and that's like mirrors the Schleifer-Greenwood paper where they show like strong correlation across surveys of expectations of future stock returns. But overall, we were like surprised how little evidence there is so far on these like correlations of expectation of different groups. And this is particularly true because there's just no comparable data across these groups. Yeah? So if we think about, there is no lender expectation of house price data that is like readily available that we could compare to the households. No, that it's like one of the things that like we obviously wanted to do, but we couldn't do really. So I think that's why the only evidence that we have so far on whose expectations matter come a bit from theory. Oh, and the idea is really like if you have like over-optimistic borrowers but rational lenders, the borrowers are somewhat constrained because lenders would just increase spreads and that would constrain borrowing. And on the other hand, if you have like rational borrowers but over-optimistic lenders or rational households, lenders might be constrained in their funding, even though that's probably a challenge. And I think there are two nice papers on this. Just talk about the Kaplan Violante paper, where they basically build a Hank structural model and show that you, within their model, you basically need lender optimism to generate the boom in mortgages that we saw in the run-up to the crises, but you need basically borrower expectations to be overly optimistic to have the house price bubble. So both of them matter to have these joint dynamics of prices and quantities. But I want to conclude, like, big picture by talking about like a couple of open questions that have not been addressed within this literature of sentiment-driven credit cycles. And I think one of the big questions is like, what are like the first-order effects of bias expectations? Yeah, so how can we quantify the relevance of behavioral biases? So there are a couple of papers now coming out that look at the cross-sectional variation and try to exploit the cross-sectional variation to look at like TFP and TFP misallocation. But I think we're still a bit struggling to find like the one thing that we can like say this is the evidence that the sentiment things matter. Maybe it's the financial crisis stuff that like people here are working on. Maybe it's something else. I think future will tell us. I think the second thing that we don't know really is, do we have to think about like an economy-wide measure of sentiment, or are these domain-specific expectations that are like limited to segmented markets? And so there's a paper by Dmitry Kuvchinov, which he says that there's very little co-movement in risk premia across asset classes if you think about the long run. So while you have like predictability of returns within asset class, we don't have that across asset classes. So that it's not that basically equity booms do not coincide with booms in housing and booms in credit markets in a way, like cheap credit markets. And I think this will be very interesting as well going forward. The third question we already talked about, so do expectations need to align? And the fourth thing is, I think that like everyone tends to think about the boom when we think about expectations and bias expectations. But I think there are a lot of reasons to think that bias expectations might be especially when you're thinking about the credit market, might be way more important if you think about the bust. If you think about credit being, so credit really mattering, the downside of credit risk really mattering, and if credit risk becomes salient, you can, like, it's like easy to imagine a situation where like these sentiment things might be way more important in the bust than in the boom moving forward. Right, let me conclude and hand over to Yueran.
My discussion today is not necessarily to be critical about what Alessia and Kaspar have done. They wrote a really great summary of where we stand in terms of understanding these questions. I just want to synthesize and amplify some of the things that they have said, what we have learned in terms of the role of bias expectations, and what are some of the open questions that we don't yet fully understand and want to understand better in the years to come. So a major theme of this conference is credit cycles, and the fundamental question is what drives credit cycles. And several of the previous sessions and Alessia and Kaspar's presentation point to that bias expectations have emerged as one of the very promising candidates for explaining credit cycles. So I just want to summarize several of the hints that we got in the aftermath of the financial crisis for which lead to this research direction and paved the way for this body of work. First, as Rudy has pointed out, and his work really was fundamental for this conversation, is we now understand that distorted incentives, although they're important in many settings, do not explain everything in the experience of the 2008 financial crisis, and also in combination with the work from Chen, Renan, and Xiong, which Rudy have explained in detail as well. And one of the first papers I ever wrote in college was inspired by their work to further explore some of these issues. And also the recent book, Instability by Beliefs, written by Ginelli and Schleifer, also picked up on the point that even policymakers were late to realize the issues, and the Fed in 2007, even 2008, were not fully aware of some of the issues going on. And second, we also got some hints from looking at history, for example, the work by the organizers that have had tremendous influence. So we see that credit cycles occur repeatedly in history. They're not necessarily confined to a particular institutional setting, such as original to distribute. And the previous work by people who looked to history in a less quantitative and systematic, but more episodic way, like Minsky and Kindleberger, and also Morris' reading of Karl Marx last night, also reflect a general observation that a lot of the cycles are potentially driven by optimism that lead to credit and investment booms that don't turn out well in the end. And finally, I just wanted to say that the fact that bias expectations may play an important role in asset price fluctuations is a pretty long-standing theme in behavioral finance, although previous work in behavioral finance originated very much in trying to understand fluctuations in stock markets as opposed to credit markets per se. And in recent years, we may be starting to transport some of these insights into credit markets. For example, ever since Schiller and de Bonn and Thaler in the 80s, one observation of explaining and understanding fluctuations in financial markets is that beliefs may overreact to information, which is now made more explicit using the survey data that people have collected. And then building on this, we've, over the past few years, have accumulated a very informative and insightful body of work that further make an explicit investigation of the role of beliefs. I list 4 papers here, and I realized that all of the papers have at least one author represented in this conference, so thanks to the organizer for a very comprehensive job collecting people. So the first 2 set of papers follow broadly what Tyler mentioned as a price-driven approach. When you look at prices over the credit cycles, you see that credit risk seems to be very much underpriced. And the second set of papers, number 3 and number 4, work by Rudy and Bjorn and Kaspar, are more like balance sheet data meet expectations data. Let's connect these 2 sets of data to understand how expectations drive bank decisions and what this can tell us about the role of bias expectations. For example, Rudy's work finds that fast loan growth predict performance that are not fully anticipated by either the managers or analysts, and I will go into more detail of Bjorn and Kaspar's work later. So today I want to discuss 2 things. One is the general lessons that we have learned from the work on expectations. What are the prominent themes across many different settings and domains? And second, while these insights can be helpful for thinking about credit cycles, another interesting question is what are the specific features of credit cycles that we need to take into account for thinking about this particular setting? So for the general lessons that we've learned from the work on expectations, which originated from this long-standing issue in economics of understanding what expectations really are of decision makers. For decades, we've taken rational expectations as the primary benchmark framework in research, which is a very useful theoretical construct, but not necessarily an empirical statement of how people form expectations. And in the past few years, there's a lot of work collecting data on expectations from surveys from other settings. And we've learned that expectations are observable, can be meaningfully elicited and measured in the data. And second, expectations as reflected by the data have significant explanatory power for economic decisions. And finally, there are some systematic deviations as reflected by the data in the expectations from frictionless rational benchmarks. And this set of evidence comes from a number of domains, from financial markets, from macroeconomic expectations, from firms' expectations, and households' expectations. And so instead of taking the more inductive approach of rational expectations and reasoning based on first principles, now we're taking a much more deductive approach of looking at the data across different domains. And a really important component of this work is to find a consistent structure across different settings to know what is a pervasive feature in expectations. And fortunately, we found a lot of clues in this pursuit. So as Alessia mentioned, what we have seen across many different domains is pervasive indications of the tendency to over-extrapolate, which is that people think that recent shocks or recent trends are likely to persist more than they actually do in reality. And this has emerged from data on financial markets, from data on macroeconomics and corporate earnings and house prices, for example, Alessia's work, and even in very simple, the simplest controlled experiments. So these are just some examples to visualize what these tendencies are. For example, one of the motivating facts used in the work of Bordello, Ginoli, and Schleifer is to look at the forecasts of credit spreads that financial analysts in top financial institutions make and look at the forecast errors. And we see that errors are systematically predictable. In particular, when current spreads are high, people tend to think that future spreads will continue to be high, which are not justified by reality, and therefore they predict negative errors, and vice versa. So people have a tendency to think that credit spreads will persist more than it actually does. And then in the realm of, for example, banks forecasting earnings or CFOs in forecasting earnings in general, we also find this pattern. This is thanks to a tremendous amount of data collected by John Graham and Cam Harvey from the Duke CFO survey. Whether you look at the firm level, which is proprietary data that they have access to, or if you look at the aggregate, for example, what Kaspar and Yueran had done and what Nicola, Andre, and I did a few years ago for CFOs in general, you'll see this pattern that when current earnings are high, people think it will persist more than it actually does, and when current earnings are low, people are overly pessimistic. And then finally, it is important to understand how these expectations link to decisions. And we have also now accumulated a set of evidence that point to very important role in expectations as reflected in the data for explaining decisions. In stock markets, there is a set of very interesting papers to show both pension fund managers and clients of Vanguard funds, their expectations actually do translate a lot into investment decisions and for firms as well. So these are the general themes that we have learned, and then in the context of credit cycles, we can see that a narrative that emerges that have been repeated by several of the previous presenters, and let me just reinforce it again, is the following logic, that initially there are some good shocks, good fundamental shocks, that people over-project into the future, due to this tendency to over-extrapolate, and that contributes to credit expansions, and maybe credit expansions is self-fulfilling to some extent for a period, and then at some point a reversal happens and you start seeing losses and people start becoming overly pessimistic about the future. There's a moment of recognition and then crisis and panic. There are several steps in this chain, and I think the paper that has traced out these steps Most fully, among all the papers that we have seen, is the recent work by Yueran and Kaspar. So they show the first step, which is high past profit, leads to over-optimism in, for example, CFO's expectations, bank CFO's expectations as measured from Graham Harvey data. And then over-optimistic CFO expectations tends to lead to high credit growth, and then high credit growth predicts a higher probability of crisis. This chain is almost full by this point, but there's a few junctions that we can think more about. For example, what are the typical triggers of the reversals? Is it just over-optimistic expectations, and at some point do not last forever, or that you start seeing bad loans getting sour and you start seeing losses? What are the particular triggers? And connecting to Matt's work, for example, at some point your investors also start panicking. So tracing out some of the more details would be very interesting. And also, as Kaspar mentioned at the end, one of the biggest challenges in doing this work, especially from a reduced form perspective, is it's not very straightforward to quantify the role of the bias component of expectations. We can show that expectations in general contribute to decisions, but how much of the decisions and how much of the potential mistakes in decisions arise from the bias component of expectations, that's not the most straightforward thing to do directly from the data, and it often requires that one takes a much more structural and perspective to the data and put a lot of structure on the data. But I think a transition to the second part of my discussion is one can apply this type of logic to any firm. One can apply this logic of overinvestment to a non-financial firm. You see good shocks, you over-extrapolate, you overinvest, the investment turns bad, and then you contract investment. Is there anything special about credit? This logic can hold. This logic of bias expectations driven boom-bust cycles can hold even in a world of Modigliani Miller. Is there anything special about financial structure and the role of credit, given that so much work that have accumulated to show that credit somehow contributes in a distinct way to business cycle fluctuations? So let me just talk about two aspects of financial structure that we can think about. One is what Alessia and Kaspar have mentioned, the beliefs of lenders, upside and downside, and this ties to the structure of the credit being part of the debt contract. So again, as I said, theory has provided us some guidance. I think even before we go to the full fleshed out Hank models, there's some simple and elegant theory, for example, from the work of Alp Simsek that provides guidance for how to think about this. It shows that the existence of debt contract can contribute the most to asset prices if borrowers are particularly optimistic about the upside. So if their optimism is concentrated in the upside, they don't think that the loan is too expensive. They will be willing to borrow and buy the asset. Or if lenders are too optimistic about the downside, so they don't fully price in default risk, as Tyler's presentation pointed to in the morning. This also ties to one of the things this conference got me thinking about, which is what is the precise definition of credit cycles that we want. If the definition is we see high credit to GDP ratio, then both borrowers and lenders' optimism are part of this definition. Whereas if we have a more specific definition of credit cycles tied to credit supply shocks along the lines that Tyler talked about, along the lines of Sam's work, then the focus is much more about lenders' beliefs. And then once we recognize that it's not necessarily just a belief about the central tendency that matters in the setting of debt contract, it's also the belief about the upside and downside that can matter, then we want to understand more about the beliefs of the other moments. But the data on beliefs so far are generally about are not about tail outcomes, they're about central tendencies. So it'd be super interesting if people start looking at beliefs about tail outcomes and understand the structure of them better. And also on the modeling side, when we look at the current models that are being proposed about bias expectations, they're generally saying that the subjective belief about the outcomes is a mean shift of the objective belief. So there's nothing special about the way people perceive particular tail outcomes. There is some classes of models that say there's something special about tail outcomes. For example, the class of models about overconfidence, which is that people underestimate the probability of tail outcomes in general, but that's not about cycles. So we don't know whether in boom times people become, not just there's a shift up in the level of means, but maybe also a shrink in the confidence interval. We don't know whether these things are true. So there are many open questions on this domain in terms of both the theory and empirics on beliefs, not just about central tendencies, but also about tail outcomes. And then the final place where financial structure can matter is if biased expectations somehow can interact with financial frictions and amplify the shocks, further amplify the role of financial frictions. So one of the general questions in understanding the role of biased beliefs is what are the settings where biased beliefs have the most impact? Is a setting with financial frictions the type of setting where biased beliefs can have more impact when firms have borrowing constraints and sometimes borrowing constraints can tighten or loosen because of lenders' biased beliefs? And what is the effect of a contract or institutional structure? For example, the role of debt and leverage, financial intermediaries versus direct financing. Is it particularly important when biased beliefs happen in a setting with very heavy financial intermediation relative to a setting of direct debt financing? And so the literature of financial frictions really started by trying to understand fragility and amplification. And there's the scope for biased beliefs to help further take this topic further, but also tying back to what shapes the booms, what got credit cycles to start to begin with. If people have biased beliefs, if the only contracts available are debt contracts, is that different from biased beliefs compared with the world of complete contracts? Do contracts play a role in amplifying how much people can act on their biased beliefs? So all these are still open questions for thinking about how biased beliefs interact with credit cycles. So a brief summary of what we have learned is I think there's accumulating evidence that expectations help explain credit expansions and crises. We've seen accumulated evidence, for example, from Yueran and Kaspar's work. And this ties very nicely in with the consistent feature and expectations that we see across many different domains, the tendency of over-extrapolation. And then the open questions, and there are a lot. One is we want to seek a holistic model, but when it comes to these models and when you start seeing some of the very recent work that take a crack at this modeling effort, one decision that one needs to make is it just tying beliefs to boom-bust cycles in general, or tying beliefs to something specific, like credit cycles, where you embed specific contract structures? And the second, as Kaspar mentioned, we really hope to understand and quantify the role of biased beliefs in crisis. We have this narrative, but how much of the credit cycles can be quantitatively explained by biased beliefs is still an open question. And the third question is, what triggers reversals? What triggers is it a reversal in beliefs triggered by start seeing losses, or it's just a natural evolution of beliefs? And the fourth question is to disentangle the role of beliefs of lenders and borrowers. And finally, the interaction of beliefs with specific contract structures and institutional structures, how beliefs and financial structure tie together. So I will just end with one quote from the musical Hamilton. There are a million things we haven't done, and we will do more in the years to come. Thank you.
So this relates to both the sort of expectations formations and the distributed reversals. And I was just curious if you get a sense, especially the house price one was striking, and if you get a sense of whether people are reacting to their own personal experiences and whether they see any sort of change in their house prices in their vicinity that cause them to change their thing, or whether it's news that they're getting about what's going on in house prices that may be outside of their own vicinity that's leading them to change their expectations.
Well, so in this particular case, it is house prices they have experienced in the local area of residence, in their city of residence. But this result fits into a broader literature. So there is evidence, for example, that people. So this evidence of extrapolation is there, no matter whether you take national house prices, local house prices. Of course, the role of national house prices is going to be less relevant. But there is also evidence of cross-sectional variation. For example, if people close to you, so there is a recent paper by Teresa Quattrone and Johannes Strobel using Facebook data, where they show that basically if people close to you have experienced a positive period of house price growth, you become more optimistic about your own prospects in house price growth in your area of residence. So basically the idea is that you tend to take information or overreact to all sorts of information. The closer to you, the more you overreact.
So I just want to come back to an issue that Yueran raised about, the specificity of this to credit cycles, because, in the stock market, like market goes up, market goes down. I mean, there was the high tech boom, which certainly featured a large decline and a lot of disagreement. And so I guess the question is, if this is what's going on, maybe we just react the way we react to stock price movements, which is like, okay, who cares? Like, just let it happen. We don't need to regulate anything. I mean, there's generally agreement that there's not, we don't, if the stock price goes down currently in the United States, we don't step in and buy, the government doesn't step in and buy stock prices, buy stocks.
I'm just not sure that I understand the question. So
If
you
you're
mean
drawing
basically
an analogy to say, if it's about beliefs and not, say, kind of about multiple equilibria, for instance, or about bank runs, then I don't, what do you see as a role for regulation?
So of course, there is a lot. This criticism is there a lot. It's saying, okay, well, if it's all about expectations, then policymakers have no role. I'm speaking for myself again, not for the place where I work, but I think if beliefs are the problem, then regulators have a lot of work to do. Because then you really need to cap the loan to income, the loan to value ratios. You need to think about borrower side measures as opposed to let's just keep monetary policy tight or not. So I come from perhaps a different background. I mean, I'm talking about housing markets here, and of course, housing markets have a macroeconomic relevance that is less there for stock prices to a certain extent because they impact consumption much more. The number of households that own stocks is much smaller than the number of households that own housing. So,
I think clearly the expectations play the strongest role in the movement up or the movement down, but there's a lot of attention to the Minsky moment as to when do the expectations change. I was once chairman of the board of a company that managed a land area in Tanzania about the size of Rhode Island, where the wildebeest migration goes outside the national park. So I became fairly familiar with watching wildebeest. And I spent a lot of time on the Mara River, where they cross and the crocodiles come to try to get them. Well, they sit over on the side, and you get stuck there, and you have to sit there for hours and watch them. Because a game begins as they predict which wildebeest is going to lead the others. And so you're looking for this sort of influencer wildebeest. Which wildebeest is going to lead them across the river first? And what I'm wondering is that in your study of expectations, is it worthwhile to look at the work being done in marketing and in media on influencers? Because they seem to, at the margin, shape a shift in opinion, and then suddenly all 15-year-olds are wearing yellow shoes or something. But there's a role for influencers, and we see it in the way baboons move across across the savannah, and we see it the way wildebeest decide when they're going to cross the river and when they're not. And as a hedge fund trader for years, I could see it in just one or two decisions by a few houses just decided to sell a little bit or buy a little bit, and then there would be a wave of buying that followed that.
I mean, you can later answer your question, but I think, like, overall, I think this question, like, who leads, who follows, I think it's super interesting. I hope that we will get at this now that we have, like, our micro data ready to go. so with Matt and Moritz. So we can really look at the individual banking institutions and see if there are like some banks that are like early on, late on. What's the role of big banks versus small banks and so on. And I think that would be very interesting. No? Are there the Warren Buffetts in the room that can influence the market or not, basically?